Preparing to live stream, just give me another minute. All right. Well, we are all good to go here. We are streaming on Facebook and YouTube. So I'm going to start recording here and we will go ahead and get started if that sounds good to you, Doug and Phil. Great. Thanks. All right. Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm sure we're going to have some more folks trickle in as the evening moves forward, but we're really excited to be here. My name is Margaret Stern, and I'm the Program and Communications Director for the Susitna River Coalition. For those of you who are new to the Susitna River Coalition, we're a nonprofit working to protect the ecological, cultural, and community here in the Susitna watershed. And we also engage in a lot of conversations about energy, infrastructure, and land use decisions. So tonight is part of our winter speaker series where we host different interesting speakers from across the watershed throughout the darker months and kind of create a space for deeper conversations that look into long-term impacts, interesting lifestyles, and research going on within the Susitna Basin. So this series is funded in part by the Jessica Stevens Community Foundation, and we are so grateful for their support in making events like this accessible to our community. So this evening's event, as you all know, is focused on Alaska's energy systems within the Railbelt and how the past and present infrastructure decisions continue to influence costs, landscapes, and communities across the Railbelt. So rather than debating a single project, tonight is kind of about giving context, how we got here, what options exist, and what trade-offs kind of go into all the decisions that are made. So we're really excited and fortunate to be able to be joined by two fantastic speakers tonight who come at these questions from different complementary perspectives. So first, we'll hear from Doug Johnson, who's the Director of Development for ORPC here in Alaska. So ORPC is a hydrokinetic energy company working on power solutions that draw energy from free-flowing rivers and tides. And Doug has been involved with ORPC in Alaska since 2006. Today, he leads ORPC's Alaska team, which is engaged in a number of projects across the state. We'll also hear from Dr. Philip Wight, who's the Associate Professor of History in Arctic and Northern Studies over at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, though he's visiting us from overseas today. So thank you for waking up at 3:30 in the morning to give this presentation. So Phil is an energy and environmental historian whose work focuses on infrastructure, mobility, and climate, particularly in Alaska and the circumpolar north. He teaches Alaska history, energy history, and climate history, and is currently finishing a book entitled Arctic Artery, which it will be coming out of the Washington Press. Correct me if I'm, yes, great.
University of Washington Press, yeah.
Okay, great. And in addition to his academic work, Phil has spent more than 6 years advocating for ratepayers as an energy policy expert with ACPERG, and including leading the successful passage of Alaska's community solar legislation. So together, these two speakers, Doug and Phil, are going to help us look at Alaska's energy systems from technical and historical angles, helping us understand what's possible, what's inherited, and what questions we should be asking as we move forward. So as we get going with this, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. How we're going to run this tonight with two speakers is we're going to have Doug give his presentation, maybe take a couple questions if you have them, go on to Phil, and then host more of a conversation at the end. But feel free to enter your questions into the chat as we get going. We'll get them all answered for you. Thank you so much for being here. And Doug, I will pass the screen over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Here we go. Okay, got my slides up?
Yes.
All righty. Well, thank you. Well, Really a pleasure to be here this evening here in Alaska. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Doug Johnson, and as Margaret said, I'm with Ocean Renewable Power Company. I really lead the effort here in Alaska for our projects here. I actually helped bring the company to Alaska in 2006 and have been working diligently over that period to continue to look at a new energy source, which is hydrokinetic energy. And the key thing here with our technology in that first slide you can see there in sort of the upper left, that's the machine that's currently deployed, one of the two machines currently deployed at Igiugig, Alaska on the Kivijak River. And that turbine spins in the water when it's submerged, and then it is brought to the surface for repair and or cleaning and that sort of thing, basically annually. The picture to the right, immediate right of that, is a project we're doing in Canada, a demonstration project at just east of Montreal in a sort of downstream from a conventional hydro project, which is quite interesting and very gives us a very unique flow to work in. And then we've got a picture with a larger photo there is actually in Patagonia in Chile. And that is a project that we're looking to deploy our turbines there in some of the remote Patagonian environments that are looking for reducing the cost of their energy. They're having to burn diesel for most of the remote lodges and things. So we're going to be deploying there. So that's just a little bit about kind of the hydrokinetic sort of devices, if you will. Now let's talk a little bit about, what we have in terms of our sheets here. And this is, there we go. So a little bit about the company. So we've been around actually since 2004 as a company. Like I said, we brought the program to Alaska in 2006. The company has grown from just a handful of us in 2004 to over 50 employees right now in 4 countries. So we're having a real growth spurt, particularly in Europe at the moment, tremendous amount of energy, and also in Canada at the moment. So it's been a really interesting time, and things seem to be going quite well in other parts of the world. Things have slowed down a little bit with the new administration here in the United States for us. The active Alaska projects I want to talk a little bit about tonight are really 4 different projects. The first project we're doing is a rather large assessment project for Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. We've been looking at the 59 of their communities around the state that we believe may have hydrokinetic opportunities associated with them. As you may know, that most of the communities in Alaska, rural Alaska, have water as part of their community, literally at their front doors for most of them. So we're assessing, what might be potential good projects for hydrokinetics for Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, and that report will be done this year. The next project is really quite interesting. It's the project in Falls Pass, and for those of you who don't know the geography, it's really the first place in the Aleutian chain where the Gulf of Alaska meets the Bering Sea. Very interesting, very robust tidal energy resource that we've been exploring there since 2012. I spoke a little bit about our project at Igiugig. It is the premier riverine hydrokinetic energy project in the world today. Quite a living laboratory for us. Learned a tremendous amount, and we'll talk more about each of these projects as we move through the evening. And the last is really the big project for us. It's the American Tidal Energy Project, which we're looking to launch in Cook Inlet. And it's a project that's near and dear to my heart. Growing up here in Anchorage, one of my first summer field projects that I did when I was at university was to survey for the one of the first submarine cables that Chugach Electric put across the inlet. And we were anchored up to a tidal buoy between Cairn Point, which is just right by the entrance to Jay Bear, and Point McKenzie. And the tide changed. And while we were having lunch, in about 15 minutes, we were in the middle of a raging river. And that was one of the things that really got me excited about the opportunity to work with the tidal energy that was right in my backyard in Cook Inlet.
This map gives more detail on the results of the desktop study and assessment in terms of which communities were selected.
Sorry, that was an overlay that I didn't expect to launch. But anyway, that project that just came through there was our little more about where our projects were at Igiagig, where they physically were, excuse me, in the AVAC project, the communities that we're looking at around the state. Basically, it's the Kuskokwim, the Yukon, and then a few tidal communities around the coast. So it really goes everything from Yakutat down in the Gulf all the way up to Kayana, just off the Kobuk River. So it's quite an expansive assessment, and we're going to be, like I said, that report will be done this year. And there are already a couple of really great sites that we've identified. But the map that's in front of us at the moment is a map that really starts to look at the three other projects that we're focusing on: the Alaska Tidal Energy Project, ATEP there in Cook Inlet, our Igiagig project, which we've been working on quite particularly in this last couple of years, really focused on trying to get completely off diesel, to go full diesels off with a battery energy storage system associated with it. And then our project in False Pass, which we'll see a little bit more about as we move along. So Igiagig is really quite remarkable. That image there is exactly how it is. It's the Kvichak River is one of the most beautiful rivers in Alaska. Before we put anything in the water, we spent a lot of time out there with the community, understanding what they were doing, how fishing was working, where they fished, how they worked, how they used the river. And one of the days it was super hot, and we literally jumped in the river to swim, and I could literally open my eyes in the water as we were swimming in the river. It's quite remarkable. There's our one turbine is deployed. You can see it under the water there, and the other turbine is being positioned for deployment. But that's basically what we've got going there in the river today. And though both those devices can operate year-round, we have had quite a slowdown this year. There's been a lot of icing in the river. That river generally doesn't freeze fully, but this year we had some super cold weather, and we had basically super cooled water, and we ended up with what's a condition called frazzle ice, and ice was getting on the devices. So we basically suspended operation for a short time while we dealt with that, and now we're back into getting ready to start the turbines running again. But it's really quite a remarkable locale, and really neat community, and fantastic. It's been a fantastic partners. False Pass is just that. The reason it's called False Pass, again, it's the first place that the Aleutian chain really opens between the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. And it's an amazing tidal energy resource. And it's false as a pass. You can get through there with small boats, but ships can't make it through. So large ships have to go all the way around. They can't make it through the pass. But fishing vessels frequently traverse the pass quite interestingly. And what we're looking to do here is really, we did some early assessment work in 2012, and now we're ready to really go in, firm up the assessment work that needs to be done, do some community grid upgrades there to be able to accept a hydrokinetic device. And we're looking at having this project come online in terms of, first electrons. If we can find the right spot, it's going to be a few years out, but it really is an amazing resource there in False Pass. And we're looking forward to getting that project up, rolling, and basically shovel ready. And here's the American Tidal Energy Project. This is a picture that's just right up near the East Foreland, right near Nikiski on the beach. And the project would be deployed right out between the N and the T in the American Tidal Energy Project. There is approximately where we would be out of. We're outside the setnet fishery that uses this area, but not too far out in the inlet. There's a tremendous tidal stream here. There's times that the water flows faster than 4 meters per second. It's truly world class in terms of its scope and scale. It's really quite interesting when you think about Cook Inlet, because here we are in this amazing ecosystem that is right near where we need energy, and there is a ton of energy. The watershed in itself is quite remarkable. 47,000 square miles is the Cook Inlet watershed, comparable to the size of the state of New York and Pennsylvania combined. It's really, really something. One of America's largest coastal drainage basins. And in that light, it's full of tidal energy. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory has now pretty much fully characterized the inlet, and they believe there's at least 18 gigawatts of resource available there. Just to give you a sense, we use about just under 1 gigawatt for the whole Railbelt grid at peak. So it is a tremendous resource that's out here, and we're doing our best to move it along and get it developed. We're actually in the process of a project that has been suspended at the moment due to the change of administration and all the challenges and reorganization that the Department of Energy is going through. When we started this project, there were two projects that were basically launched concurrently in 2024, 2025. Our project in Cook Inlet and another project in Puget Sound by a company named Alpalco. We were successful in getting through phase one. We delivered all our deliverables on time and within budget. And then the administration changed, and we got basically shut down. So we've been in suspension now since the new administration's come in, and we were told we were going to have a green light, yellow light, or a red light by December 31st, and that hasn't happened yet. We were told that the government shutdown basically slowed things down tremendously, and that we were supposed to know by year end, but we're still waiting for some sense of direction from DOE. We feel like we've got a great project. Phases 2 through 5, as you can see here, would happen. Again, it's going to be, if we're fortunate enough, it would be 26 through 2031 at this point. But we'd hope we could hold to that schedule. We've already lost a field season last year that we had hoped to have under our belts by now. Just a little bit about the devices that are going to go into the inlet. This is a company based actually in the UK that Proteus that has what's called their AR series. And this device that we're looking to put in is what's called a megawatt scale device. It has the ability to generate 1.75 megawatts. And for this demonstration project in Cook Inlet, we're going to be delivering between 1 and 5 megawatts. So we needed a device that could generate at least a megawatt. And the devices that we have today are kilowatt scale devices. So this is an order of magnitude larger than our devices, and is a great device. It's been tested, and it's got literally thousands of hours of runtime on these devices in the UK. So we're really excited to be looking to bring this device to Cook Inlet. Along with that, we are also hopeful that we'll get to test at least one of our devices, our Tigen 80, which is an 80 kilowatt device that we're going to be looking to deploy in smaller, more community-based tidal energy environments around the world. So we're hoping to be able to test this along with the large Proteus device in the Cook Inlet system. A lot of project partners here. Part of our success has been having really fantastic partners here. Most of the partners are Alaska-based, and it's been quite a remarkable opportunity to see growth in this concept of partnering. When I first started this effort in bringing this company to Alaska in 2006, there were no partners. But it was really quite remarkable that Homer Electric really stood up and became one of the first real partners, and right behind them was the university, and then the Kenai Peninsula Economic Development District, CAPED, and then all these others just sort of start to build on, and now we've got such a remarkable group of partners and supporters. And then, of course, our technical support from the national laboratories has been fantastic. We have really remarkable national labs that are very supportive of our work. And just to note a couple of the accomplishments, we did 17 phases or 17 different pieces in phase one. All those 17 deliverables we submitted on time within budget. We did a 1,350-page draft pilot license for FERC. That got done on time and within budget. We got 20 letters of support from virtually all the key players in Alaska. And we're ready to go for future work. All we're doing right now is just standing by for the Department of Energy to say yes. So this is a really, really exciting time, and we're just standing by. And I was hopeful that I'd be able to give a positive a report tonight, but unfortunately, we did not get a green light yet. So that's pretty much where we're at, and that's just a little bit about my overview of the company, kind of what we're doing. Happy to answer a few questions before we hear Phil's presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. Just so everyone knows, feel free to put questions into the question and answer. And Doug, one question I have for you is how, like with the situation in Igiagig with more ice, how do you kind of think about that moving forward if you have additional cold weather years? How long was the energy creation offline?
Yeah, really, great question. And the thing about this is that at Igiagig, it's really a unique river. We know that the sites like on the Yukon and the Kuskokwim are more than likely initially going to be seasonal. There may be opportunities in some of the deeper spots of the Yukon to run year-round, but we know that the flows will be dramatically reduced. We've got a project on the Yukon in Canada at Fort and in our Canada operation. We've already done some preliminary assessments of winter flows, and we can see that they're quite reduced. So we know if we can operate year-round, it'll be lower flows and lower energy.
Got it. Thanks. And then another question, as you're looking at these rivers, what are kind of some of the determining characteristics when you're deciding a site? Because that seems so complicated.
It has its complications, but it actually is pretty simple. In the riverine environments, what we look for is about 5 meters of water and about 2 meters per second of flow. If we've got those two basic parameters, we're good to start really looking. There's so many other, as you can imagine, things that you need to consider, particularly, the communities and what are the communities' needs and how do we fit into what they want to do and make sure that we're not, interacting in a way that's going to impede or retard anything that they want to do in their community. So that's a really big thing. And we've learned a lot over the years in Igiagig. And like I said, they've been such a fantastic partner. And, it's allowed us to operate the device with, millions of salmon swimming by. And we've had, no negative interactions with the fish yet. Thank goodness. And also we see this, the big thing we're really trying to understand now is the outmigration of the smolt to make sure that it's safe for smolt migration. Because we're seeing that the adult salmon in the return they don't want to be in the middle of the river where the strongest currents are. They use the eddies. They're really smart coming up river. So they really don't interact with the device. But in the outmigrations with the smolt, they do migrate right over the top of the devices. But they're significantly below the surface, and most of the smolts are in the top 18 inches of the water. So we're watching that very closely.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think I was struck in your presentation as you were talking about we were noticing where people were fishing and kind of thinking about the communities as you were thinking about where to place those. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Mark Masteller is asking, in Cook Inlet, what is the best way to avoid salmon and belugas?
Great question, Mark. They're really very different. The salmon we're not really concerned about. I think we pretty much retired risk on salmon from all the run time that we've experienced in Igiagig. We will still explore it, but from what we know, we don't think we're going to be have much of a problem with the salmon at all. But we are very concerned and really need to understand more about beluga. We've never had a beluga interact with the device yet, so we really don't know. And it's really important that we do get some time in the water with the machines just sitting there, where the beluga might be able to interact before the machines are even running. And we did do some testing at Nikiski preparing to go to Igiagig, and we did some deployments and retrievals. Unfortunately, no beluga were around there at the time, so we didn't get to see them interact with the device. But we've got a lot of data around kind of how they move in the inlet. And one of the nice things is our site that we're looking at there at the East Foreland, there hasn't been much beluga activity there in the last few years. So we're monitoring that data, and as we get this project, if we're fortunate enough to get this project going, we'll be monitoring that continually.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think that that answers Dulcie's question is how does the equipment in the river affect salmon runs? And then Melis Cody is asking, have you heard of a run-of-river energy project that is in a subterranean environment like an aquifer?
Wow, that's cool. I have not. But very interesting, and I think that yeah, if there were good enough flows, it'd be a specialized turbine, I would imagine, that would have to be purpose designed and built for that. But what a cool idea! I hadn't thought that's great. Yeah, because
Yeah,
there's some pretty strong submarine aquifers in really karst topographies around the world. So that's a cool idea.
for your next project. We'll expect a report back. And then Mike has a question for you, and this might be the last question before we move on to Phil, and then we'll wrap up with a group question. So are you doing research in the Tanana River?
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, well, we started in the Tanana. That's the really fun thing. We literally started in the Tanana, and we pioneered what is now the Alaska Hydrokinetic Research Center in the Tanana. And we pioneered that, and we basically gave that to the University of Alaska Center for Energy and Power to continue to work there. The Tanana is great, and there's some opportunity there. We were enlightened to the opportunity at Igiugig, and it was just such an incredible, beautiful site at Igiugig because we could physically see the device in operation and with cameras watch the salmon interact, which we could not do in the Tanana, as you well know. And the other thing with the Tanana, that to be able to be successful there, we've really got to work with debris issues, particularly developing some kind of debris diversion device. Dr. Jerry Johnson has pioneered that to a high degree. We tested that on the river and threw a bunch of big logs at it, and it works really well for surface debris. So we think we've got that risk pretty retired as well, but there's still some other issues that we have to work to be able to be successful in the Tanana.
Yeah, very interesting. It's wild how every site brings its own issues, as you're talking
Absolutely.
about this. Well, thank you so much, Doug, and thanks for sticking around so that we can kind of ask you some more questions at the end as we gain a little bit more historical perspective with Phil. So Phil, thanks for starting to share your screen, and looking forward to getting more of a historical perspective on the Railbelt.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Margaret, and Susitna River Coalition for the invitation. And thank you, Doug, for your presentation. I learned a lot there. And it's actually quite ironic. Where I'm sitting right now in the UK is not too far from the River Severn, which is the largest river basin in the UK and one of the highest tidal potentials in the world, and really not far from Bristol, where, as you know, Proteus is located. So it's a small world, even when we get outside of Alaska. But for my presentation today, as a historian, I really want to focus on exactly what Margaret said before, which is about the context, the big picture, right? How did we arrive at this position that we are at today? And like all stories, there's many different places that we could begin. But the place that I want to begin goes back 120 years. And it goes back to the year 1904, which heralded a really bright future for Alaska. In two distant cities, nearly 500 rail miles from each other, Alaskans were busy electrifying the far north. In the bustling town of Seward, founded as the terminus of the Alaska Central Railroad, Seward Light and Power began constructing a 225 kilowatt hydroelectric generator on Lowell Creek that would power the young town by 1905. At the other end of the eventual 470-mile rail line, the Northern Commercial Company constructed a wood-fired steam plant that burned an astounding 8,500 cords of wood per year to provide Fairbanks with heat and electricity. And that's the picture that you see here. And this power plant was really crucial, a really crucial development, which helped to cement Fairbanks as the regional center of interior Alaska and the future terminus of the Alaska Railroad. Turns out that having steam heat and hot water makes a big difference to the miners, and they will travel an extra distance to your city if you have that. And so these two kind of seemingly disparate electric developments, largely forgotten in Alaska today, were catalyzed by the discovery of gold and formed the northern and southern terminus of what would become Alaska's most important electrical infrastructure, the Railbelt electric grid. In fact, this electric grid is it's the biggest American electric grid outside of the continental United States, right? At least in terms of line miles and size. And so modern Alaska really emerged alongside the development of electric power, and it provided Alaska with a really important new energy carrier that facilitated human health, settlement, and development. And, we often talk about electrification today in terms of decarbonizing the economy and bringing online more renewables, but electrification is a long-term process that has been happening for over 100 and actually even longer, basically 150 years at this point. And so we really, as a historian, I would encourage us to look at that broader swath. And I think that context is really crucial because, as we all know, the looming natural gas shortages are forcing more people to think about their material reality, right? Where do our heat and electricity come from? And so I hope this presentation helps to foreground the very materiality of energy that's too often an afterthought, right? Too often we just walk in a room and flip a switch and expect there to be power. But I think as Alaskans know more than anybody else, we really have to think about where that power has come from. All right. So I want to make a few arguments to you all here. And as we do this, maybe I'll just show a couple quick slides first. There's a number of different ways that we can envision the growth of electric power, the growth of the rail belt. This is a wonderful image from Gwen Holdman's master's thesis that shows the expansive geographical growth of electrification, starting all the way back in the early 1900s. Another way we could view it is this wonderful diagram, and this comes from Launch, Alaska, and it's really thinking about not just new technological innovations, but also new social or organizational innovations. So things like the emergence of rural electric cooperatives, which we all know are the powerhouses of Alaska, but that was not a foregone conclusion, right? That was a major fight in the 1930s between public and private power, who would electrify. And so, there's different ways that we can visualize this progress over time. And then finally, much of this research that I'm sharing with you all comes from a history I wrote for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power called Electrifying the Railbelt, a Generation in Transmission History. And this is a chart which comes from there, which tracks the growth of installed capacity of different sources over time for the rail belt. So I know some of the it's quite small here, but basically it shows that bottom is coal, and then we have the emergence of diesel gensets, and then we really get the blue is hydro on here, and then you can just see the explosion of natural gas. So the majority of our installed electrical capacity on the Railbelt has been natural gas, but we've also seen a diversity of other sources. And then, you can really see solar and wind starting to make inroads on there. And so, again, different ways that we can visualize this growth over time. And this diagram back here, I mapped, as far as I can tell, every single power plant that was ever built on the rail belt to figure out, what have we built over time? How did we build it? How did that progress happen? And so maybe I'll just spend a moment on this image of the Tanana Valley Railroad up here in Fairbanks as I think about a couple of the big picture arguments that I want to make about the development of the rail belt, the development of the, electrifying the rail belt. Because as a historian, history is argument here and now, right? It's not enough just to tell a story. We need to be really clear about big picture. Why did change over time occur? And so in the biggest picture, the Railbelt has witnessed several key periods of remarkable generation and transmission growth. And these golden eras, as one could call them, occurred when the state, the federal government, rural electric cooperatives, all of these were aligned. And so since 1904, the Railbelt has constructed over 2.7 gigawatts of electrical generation in over 1,600 miles of high voltage transmission, often during one of these key golden eras. And so each period has built from the accomplishments and the infrastructures of the preceding period, which has resulted in an accretionary development pattern, right? Each of these has built upon each other. And actually, let me go to this. Oh, maybe I don't have it on this slide deck. So another major argument that I want us to think about here is that there has really been an asymmetry versus between generation and transmission. What do I mean by that? Historically, utilities have really focused on building the power plants that generate the electricity rather than focusing especially on these larger high voltage lines that connect us together and allow for the interregional movement of electrons. Okay, why is this? One is that the rail belt emerged as these independent communities, Seward on one end, Fairbanks on the other, then Anchorage, emerges with the development of the railroad. And the utilities were really focused on their specific localities. That's still true today, right? Maybe just for the first time, we have entities that are really concerned about the entire rail belt. The other thing is that in Alaska, heat really matters. Heat is the tail that wags the dog. So we probably have more power plants per capita than anywhere else in the United States. And I think one of the reasons that's true is because we often have what are called cogen plants or cogeneration plants. We are interested in not only producing electricity, but we need to produce heat as well. That's especially true of Fairbanks, but we can see that in other places as well. And then, one of the other reasons that we have not focused as much on transmission as we should is because we've lacked a centralized transmission authority because the rail belt has always been disconnected from other interstate power systems, right? We have not been controlled or regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and that has created a very different landscape up here. The last argument I'll give to you all, and then I'll get right into my narrative, is that, despite the focus on generation, transmission is what has fueled the growth of the rail belt grid and Alaska's energy transmissions. So the key statement would be this: the flexibility of transmission has facilitated the diversification of generation. What do I mean by that? Okay, so we'll talk about the Alaska Intertie that was built in 1985, 1986 to connect Fairbanks with Anchorage. Ironically, the only reason that happened is because they thought Susitna was going to come online and we were going to be able to use that power from Susitna. Well, obviously, Susitna Watana Hydro did not happen, but that line has been crucial for delivering other sources of power to Fairbanks, predominantly natural gas generation, but it was really about also delivering Bradley Lake Hydro to Fairbanks. That was part of the inception of the project. And we can easily imagine a world where we develop big wind in interior Alaska that's much bigger than the needs of GVA, and then we can send that wind power south. So again, the flexibility of transmission has facilitated the diversification of generation. And maybe one other kind of ironic point that I'll make here is that we think about the rail belt grid, but the rail belt grid is pretty new, and it really only came about in the 1960s and 1980s when these long distance transmission lines connected hydropower facilities on the Kenai with Anchorage and Fairbanks. And so even though hydroelectric only contributes about 20% of the rail belt's electricity production, historically it has been the prime mover for constructing interregional transmission infrastructure. Um, all right, let me move through some of this history here because this is fascinating. So, by the way, this image, if you didn't pick up on this, Fairbanks had a wood-powered railroad. Everything in early Fairbanks history was powered by wood. We cut it down and we burned it, which created widespread deforestation in interior Alaska. And it is a real irony that the completion of the Alaska Railroad, the first train was able to, they actually laid the tracks across a frozen Nenana River in 1919. But the line was completed in 1923 that allowed coal to come to Fairbanks. And that actually helped save the forests of interior Alaska. So there's a lot of ironies and paradoxes in this story. One of the fascinating things is they actually had a little electric speeder car that went up and down this railroad in 1913. And so there's actually two moments in time. You had a similar kind of development in Juneau. Juneau had electrified trains run off of hydro and diesel in the 1910s that were powering some of their mining operations. So again, we think about the electrification of transportation as something new. No, 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 not at all, right? This has been a long-term drama that has been unfolding across our energy landscape. So this is a really lovely image of the construction of the Alaska Railroad. This is probably from a pamphlet in the 1940s or 1950s. And it's obvious, but I'll say it, right? We call it the Railbelt electric grid because the grid fundamentally followed the development of the railroad, right? And the railroad helped to establish the settlement patterns of this region, right? It is not a surprise that many of us live where we do today, and it's primarily because of the railroad. I think it was probably, we would have seen some type of settlement on the eastern side of Cook Inlet, northern Cook Inlet, but the reason Anchorage is there where it is today is partially because the federal government wanted to build the Alaska Railroad. They wanted to have the headquarters in Seward. And real estate prospectors drove up the price of land. And the federal government said, we're not paying those prices. So they created a tent camp in Anchorage, which, is the kind of foundational story of Anchorage. But, the backstory of all of this, and maybe the first chapter that we can talk about, is really about mining. Electricity followed the gold rush. Anywhere where there is a sufficient concentration of people and capital, an electric generator soon buzzed to life. So we see this in Dawson, Yukon, Nome, Fairbanks, Seward, all electrified with their gold rushes. And electrification was extremely important for Alaskans, right? Think about Fairbanks, in a place that gets maybe 4 hours of daylight in the middle of winter. Electric lighting makes a huge difference. And there's a great quote from Judge James Wickersham when he was coming back into the town in 1905. In 1904, it was basically like a pigsty. And he noted that with the introduction of electricity, it gave Fairbanks the appearance of, quote, a real city. So let's not take electrification for granted. It's been very important in our history here. And so from the start of the gold rushes, one of the key problems was transportation, right? Especially for a place like Fairbanks, especially for places removed from tidewater. And so one of the big challenges was who was going to build these transportation infrastructures. And actually what we saw is that private industry jumped in there first. And this is with the Copper River and Northwest Railroad. You had the Alaska Syndicate. They came in, they tapped the copper fields at Kennecott, largest copper mine in the world in the 1920s and 1930s. That railroad actually came online in 1911. The building of that railroad convinced the progressive era federal government that the federal government needed to be involved to ensure that the benefits of development could be shared with the public, right? That was the whole idea behind the Alaska Railroad. So do folks, when folks look at this map of the development of the Alaska Railroad, does anything stand out in terms of energy resources? Because energy was not an afterthought in where they decided to build this railroad. Why did they decide to build it where they did?
It looks like the Healy coal and the Matanuska coal.
That's 100% it. Yeah. Um, and so part of the justification for this line is that the US Navy wanted the coal reserves. This is before the Navy converted to petroleum. And this was during a moment of imperial expansion by the United States. And so Alaska's coal was coveted by the Navy. And if anybody who's been down to Sutton and goes by the Sutton coal washing pits, right, that was a legacy of the Navy's development. Well, it turned out that the coal in Sutton was not good coal. Certainly not for the Navy's usage. But we did see the rail line go through Healy, and we have seen widespread coal mining in Healy ever since the railroad came through there. And so, that is why the railroad is where it is, and that's why the Railbelt electric grid is where it is, right? It goes back to these foundational developments. And I would argue that more than any other single infrastructure, the Alaska Railroad transformed the energy history of Alaska and created a template for the electrification of the region. You even think about a town like Talkeetna, right? Talkeetna is there for the railroad. Wasilla was there for the railroad. Nenana, Anchorage, Palmer, all of that. There's a continuity between all of those. And then what's really interesting is when the railroad came in, it was basically the federal government that was in charge of all public services in Anchorage. So the first widespread power plant in Anchorage was this 900 kW coal plant that the Alaska Energy Commission, the group in charge of constructing the railroad, built in Anchorage. This was the first coal plant on the rail belt, and they provided much needed electricity to the city, and it signaled the coming of what we could call the coal age for the rail belt. At the same time, the construction of the railroad allowed Fairbanks to exit what was called its wood famine. Basically, they had chopped down all the wood they could access in Fairbanks to where you had to go so far to get wood that it wasn't economic for you. So Fairbanks was in a real energy crisis at the end of 1918, 1919. That coal comes in, and that spurs Fairbanks's next chapter, which was industrial mining. We built the Fairbanks Exploration Company. Well, here we go. I'll come back to that other slide. Fairbanks Exploration Company built this 9.5 megawatt power plant in Fairbanks. This was one of the largest power plants in the circumpolar north at the time. And they built it specifically for all their gold mining dredges around Fairbanks. All those gold mining dredges were electric. Okay. So the basis of Fairbanks's electrical infrastructure actually emerged from the development of this coal plant and the stringing of the wires out to those dredges in places like Chattanooga and Esther. And so the name of our local electric cooperative, Golden Valley Electric Association, is very apt. And by the way, GVA's headquarters is right next to where this building used to be. And this was the first power plant that GVA purchased. After becoming a cooperative in 1947, they purchased this plant in 1953. And this plant operated until the 60s, until Healy 1 came online. And then they dismantled this plant and they shipped it to Warm Springs, Oregon, where it was rebuilt. There's this whole wild history of these large infrastructures in the north being deconstructed and taken back south. All right, bit of an aside there. And this is one of the pictures of those giant electric dredges in my hometown of Esther. And I've put a nice little Robert Service quote over it because he wrote about them, these electric dredges that glared with fierce electric eyes. All right, I'm going to speed up the story a little bit here, but I think it's important to understand the foundations of how our grid came about. I would argue no event more transformed Alaska than World War II. Okay. It brought a flood of men, material, and funding to Alaska. The federal government spent more on the defense of Alaska in World War II than every past resource rush in Alaska's history combined. More money than gold, more money than salmon, more money than furs, more money than copper poured into Alaskan defense. The U.S. military constructed over 39 major infrastructure projects, including airfields, highways, new bases, the first hydrocarbon pipeline system in the far north, the Canal pipeline system coming from Canada. And electrification continued at its frenzied pace throughout the war. And Alaska experienced an almost seamless transition into a Cold War economy. It was actually an Alaska-based WB-29 that was flying from Eielson Air Force Base to Japan when it detected the first Soviet nuclear blast. And that really pushed us into the Cold War. Fun aside story, that B-29 should probably be in the Smithsonian. It's sitting in a gravel pit submerged in water just north of Eielson. So parts of our history are wild stories that we could tell here. If we look at what we could call defense electrification, 1941 to 1961, major aspects, major military installations bringing power to the far north. Typically, these didn't serve civilian areas, but they helped push along the Railbelt. The military in the 1950s was talking about the need to link Fairbanks and Anchorage for redundancy. And by the way, we still hear these arguments today, right? GVA gets these major grants. And why do they get them? Because there's so many military bases in the far north, right? We all know that military security is central to modern Alaska. And, the military also pioneered some new technologies. The only terrestrial nuclear reactor we've seen in Alaska was built by the US military at Fort Greely between 1962 and 1972. Whole other history that I've written on that I could talk about later. But the military and the federal governments were actually the first ones to push the idea of Susitna Watana Hydroelectric. By the way, this is the heating plant at Fort Richardson. This is the SM-1A at Fort Greely, 20 megawatts. Actually, before I talk about Susitna, I will talk about Eklutna, because Eklutna was another one of these federally driven projects, and it was a really big deal on the rail belt at the time. And again, I say rail belt, but it wasn't all electrically interconnected yet. So why was Eklutna such a big deal? There was feverish post-war growth after World War II. Our civilian infrastructure could not keep up. Between April 1950 and December 1951, Anchorage grew at an astounding 51%. And so the city actually turned to a surplus wartime generator to meet the demand. This was a T2 tank ship that had broken apart 800 miles from Adak. They towed it to the beach of Anchorage, and they ran the city partially off of its diesel generators. They had 3.5 megawatts of oil-fired boilers that provided as much as 55% of the city's electrical needs. So from 1946 to 1955, one of the biggest sources of power in Anchorage was an old World War II ship. By the way, another fascinating history. When Anchorage was done with that ship, somebody bought it in San Francisco. They towed it to San Francisco. They rebuilt it as a new kind of tanker. It was the world's largest wine tanker that transported wine from San Francisco to New Jersey and New York City. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's a wild, fascinating history. Okay, so Eklutna matters because Anchorage is running off of, this derelict old ship in the 1950s, and we needed a new source of power. And so the federal government comes in, the Bureau of Reclamation, I'm actually blanking. I forget which federal agency actually constructed Eklutna, but it was the single largest power plant in Alaska when it was built. And it still provides some of the cheapest power on the rail belt. People often say Bradley Lake does, but it's actually Eklutna. That cost will go up with some of the salmon rehabilitation efforts. When that hydro project was built, the federal government was not concerned about salmon. And we saw the negative impacts of that. But when Eklutna came online, think about this statistic, 50% of the state's power came from renewable hydropower. it wasn't just Eklutna. It was because, we were a much smaller place then, much less electricity generation. Um, but when people say, "Oh, we could never be 50% powered by renewables," I just kind of laugh and say, "We've already been there, right?" So no big surprise there. Um, so this is so this map is actually extraordinary. I could talk about this for an hour. And so this is a map that comes from a federal government survey in 1952 that people often call the Morgan Report. And Morgan was the main individual from the Bureau of Reclamation. And so the Bureau of Reclamation is encouraged by the military, look across Alaska, think about where the greatest hydro potential is, and think about how to interconnect the system. So what this map shows, two really important things that will come to dominate a lot of the rest of our history. Number one is the proposed Devil Canyon power plant on the Susitna River. Number two is an interconnected transmission system of 230 kV, which we still have not realized throughout the Railbelt, that connects Fairbanks with Anchorage all the way down to Homer, right? This is arguably the first map of a proposed Railbelt electric grid in the 1950s. And we're still, in some ways, you know, I think large aspects of this will not be realized, but we're still trying to realize this vision of an interconnected system at a higher voltage. So the federal government is really involved in trying to build a bunch of these energy projects in the 1950s. Unfortunately, these were what we might call high modernism, right? This was a belief, this was a moment in time where the federal government believed they could bend the natural world to the will of humanity. Consequences be damned, right? This was a moment in time where we proposed the Rampart Dam, would have dammed the Yukon River, created a reservoir the size of Lake Erie that would have taken 20 years to fill up, permanently changed the climate of interior Alaska, drowned 7 indigenous villages. Um, Another fun story. There was a school teacher in Fort Yukon who was really opposed to Rampart Dam, and he began campaigning against it. This was his first act of politics. His name was Don Young. Don Young got his political start fighting the Rampart Dam. Again, you literally can't make up this stuff, right? Think about how Young spent the rest of his career, his relationship with oil and gas, right? But this is where it started for Young. Doug, you're gonna love this one. So this was another diagram I found in the state archives that blew me away. Okay, so this was the scale at which people were thinking. This is the proposed Cook Inlet Tidal Power Project, proposed by Roy Johnson, consulting engineer in 1954. And their plan was everybody knew how strong the tides were in Cook Inlet. Their plans were to build these giant dikes across Fire Island, right? And to basically harness the tides, kind of like you would conventional hydro. Um, Wild project. It's really funny reading through the letters about this because, the federal officials are like, even if we could figure out the billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars to do this, we don't have a use for all the power. So I argue this is indicative of what we might call Alaska's mega project mentality, right? We have had this long running strain in the state that we want to build these giant projects that are going to bring all the benefit. And, with a few exceptions, maybe the Alcan Highway, maybe TAPS, typically these are projects that never come to fruition. And I would argue the projects that make the most difference for Alaskans are the small to medium-sized projects that we actually build, right? And Doug, I can share this with you later because I see you staring intensely at it. So there's a lot to talk about here. I won't talk about this. One of the other really important things in our history that I think we need to talk about is the development of rural electric cooperatives, right? This is not a foregone conclusion. Rural electric cooperatives are technically private, not for profit cooperatives. What does that mean? They're owned by the members they serve, but you have to be a member in order to vote in the elections, right? They're not public power in the same way ML&P was in Anchorage, or the same way, some of the large hydro projects, Tennessee Valley Authority, Bonneville Power Authority, right? Those were public power in a kind of different way. So these co-ops, at first, they're marginal. They're just electrifying the countrysides outside of places like Anchorage or Fairbanks. But now they are the engines of development of the Railbelt, right? We've got our four main co-ops. And unfortunately, even though number 7 of the cooperative principles is cooperation amongst cooperatives, historically, we've actually seen a lot of infighting in the cooperatives, which has it has certainly contoured and at times inhibited the development of the Railbelt. Just another wonderful historical image, 1965, the installed capacity in Alaska. All of the major power plants in Alaska, focusing on different regions. I'll skip through this. What I really want to get to is, and there's, okay, yeah, see, there's too much to talk about here. We can come back later. Let me get to our final couple chapters. Actually, I will mention this briefly. So this is the remnants of what was called the Davidson Ditch, which was the first 48-inch diameter pipeline in Alaska, and it was the water pipeline that brought water to Fairbanks for gold mining operations. At the end of its life, they converted this pipeline into a small-scale hydro plant. So GVA in 1960 was actually a third powered by hydro in the summer because of this infrastructure. Didn't last that long. The 67 flood wiped it out. They were actually planning on bringing it down to Valdez even before that. I don't know the full story, but there's just these wild moments in time. And some of this I would call like bootstrap innovation, right? Alaskans are really good at figuring out how to produce power from whatever we can. And I think that spirit of innovation is alive and well today in what Doug talked about in many of the other projects that we see throughout the state. So the next chapter of our history is really what I would call gassing up. And I mean that literally. It's not just methane gas, but it's also fossil fuels. And, typically we think about the North Slope, the development of TAPS, but it really began in Cook Inlet, right? It began at Swanson River in 1957. The discovery of large natural gas deposits offshore in the 1960s. The U.S. military helped to construct the first gas pipeline to Anchorage. It was a very difficult undertaking. The military totally converts off of coal to natural gas in 1968. Really, that's a fascinating moment of time that we should look at because it is a direct analogy to some of the energy transitions that we're talking about today. But we just see this after the growth of TAPS, the Railbelt becomes reliant upon natural gas in a way that it really wasn't before. And that gas was cheap for a time, but today we are recognizing that the price of that dependency, right? And by the way, we have been warning about the decline of Cook Inlet natural gas supplies since the 1970s, since the oil crisis. It really picks up in the 90s and 2000s, but that is a long-running concern. So let me get to this last chapter here. So basically, the state becomes flush with cash after TAPS comes online. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't 1977. It was really 1979. The Iranian Revolution happens. The second oil crisis happens. The price of oil absolutely skyrockets. I think it goes up 300 or 400%. The state gets way more money than it knows what to do with. The state actually already had this plan under Jay Hammond to take oil money and invest it in hydro development. State spends about $500 million on Susitna Watana before the bottom goes out under Susitna, under the oil market, and the state pulls out of Susitna. But the state does develop Bradley Lake, and it develops what was called 4-dam pool, right? Those are 4 dams in Kodiak, Valdez, Ketchikan, Wrangell. And so those 5 major hydro developments, and again, these are built after the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is really important. Alaska's, other dams like Cooper Lake and Eklutna were built before they really looked at the impact to fisheries and other resources. And I'll come back and talk about these 5 dams because these are quite important facilities. As part of Bradley Lake, as part of Susitna, we get the intertie constructed. Fairbanks and Anchorage are finally interconnected for the first time. Um, and so, this is a period of time that I call oil and water. And we often say oil and water don't mix, and they certainly didn't during Exxon Valdez. But during this moment of Alaska history, actually, the funding from oil was really crucial to bringing about, frankly, what has been the largest construction of non-fossil resources in Alaska's electrical history during this moment. Bradley Lake and Fort Ann Pool. And Bradley Lake remains, 10% of the Railbelt's power at about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And it is a facility that has been expanded over time. We still continue to expand it, taking other basins and funneling them into Bradley Lake. Okay, I realize I want to wrap this up here in just a couple minutes. And so let me offer couple kind of concluding provocations here. There's a lot that we can talk about in our recent history. We've seen some exciting developments, megawatt scale wind on the rail belt. People point to Eva Creek or Fire Island. Those are two important developments. But the first person to bring megawatt scale wind to the rail belt was Mike Kraft with his facility in 2009 in Delta Junction. Today we have increasing electrification throughout the rail belt. We have over 1,500 electric vehicles on the rail belt. If you plugged all of those in at the same time and you could draw power from them, it would be more than that Sackett's Harbor ship that was beached and powered Anchorage for a decade. Just from a nameplate capacity perspective. And maybe I'll end with just bringing this up. So as I think about the rail, people talk about the energy transition on the rail belt. And my one argument would be there's not just one transition. There's actually probably three major transitions that we're talking about. The first one is what everybody talks about, which is supply, right? We want to move into more diversified, clean, renewable options. The second one, though, is demand, which is that in order to decarbonize, every model shows we basically need to electrify as much as possible. That looks like electrifying transportation, electric vehicles. It looks like electrifying more of heating. Heat pumps would be one way to do that. Things like industrial heat. And one of the most, really inspiring stats is that if we electrified basically all of our end use devices and source that electricity from renewables and non-fossil sources, we would actually reduce our primary energy consumption by something like 50%. Why is this? Number one, most fossil fuels are inherent, they're very energy dense, but they're super inefficient. Most of the energy that you put in your gas tank is wasted as heat. Because an internal combustion engine is less than 50% efficient. EVs and heat pumps are super efficient. They tend to be 300% efficient, 300 times more efficient than many competing fossil energy devices. So the last thing I'll mention here is just organization. We need to change, and we are changing how we organize our grid, right? It's not just about how we produce and consume electrons, it's about who owns the power sources, who sells power. This is about RTOs. This is about the new RRC. It's about an integrated resource plan. So this change is happening on the ground right now. And maybe I'll just end by also thinking about this. We have built the Railbelt grid. Again, the largest electrical grid outside the lower 48 United States. And we're in a really tricky position because on one hand, this is an extraordinarily valuable machine. The Railbelt is one of the single greatest assets that we have for decarbonizing our electricity supply. When we can be interconnected, we can bring on large-scale wind, large-scale solar, right? It enables the free flow of those electrons. On the other hand, as we can see from the Swan Lake fire, we talk about climate change. The climate has changed, right? And it is now an existential threat to our electrical infrastructure. right? In interior Alaska every summer, I mean, it is so scary. The wildfires that we are dealing with, and we're dealing with them all throughout the state. So we are at this moment in time where it's not just about decarbonizing our power supply. We need to protect the infrastructure that we have from a changing climate. Because look no further than California to see what happens if we fail in that endeavor. And maybe that's not the happiest place to end, but I'll wrap it up there so that we can jump into a bunch of the questions that I know that we have.
Awesome, Phil. Thank you so much. I feel like you were saying, mind blown a couple times just about the different connections that you're pointing to throughout the history. Um, we do have a few questions in the chat. One of them is from Edward Delamari, who says, I presume economics play a large part into investments in generation versus transmission. So how have utilities on the rail belt afforded investments into transmission?
Yeah, Edward, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. And that is the reason so many of these transmission lines didn't happen. It's the reason why we haven't built a transmission line between MEA and Copper Valley, right? Transmission lines are expensive, high upfront capital costs, and they take a long time to realize their economic potentials. And so, even something like the Alaska intertie between Anchorage and Fairbanks was really at the limits of the economics at the time. And, thankfully we did that. One of the lessons I think that we can learn from this, and this is true of also of larger renewable energy projects, right? Whether it's an $800 million wind farm or whatever it might be, these projects look really expensive up front, and they are. But when you invest in these, they become really valuable long-term resources that can provide lower cost value, lower cost power with less volatility. So the answer about the economics on the rail belt, it's typically been the state government funding it, right? State government funded the Alaska intertie, or it has been the federal government. So there's a whole other story that I didn't even get to about what was called the Central Alaska Power Association, the first group of utilities that came together to try to create a rail belt grid in the 1950s. They did eventually construct the 69 kV line to Cooper Lake Hydro. So this is how the Kenai first got connected to Anchorage. They did that mostly through RUS funding, the Rural Utility Service. So the federal government has played a and that's what co-ops are in some sense. They are able to channel low cost federal funding into their investment. So there's a real irony that Alaskans have this long history of being opposed to the federal government. We are so reliant on the federal government and have been for a long time.
Edward has another question that what history might you have on electrification in more rural and remote Alaska, not the rail belt?
Yeah, Edward, I'll drop my email in the chat, and I can send you a chapter that I've written on the electrification of the state. So it does deal with Southeast Alaska, it does deal with the rail belt, but it also talks about some of those rural areas. And I know the work that you do, is absolutely centered on those. And one of the ironies that I'd point out is, the rail belt is where the carbon is, right? It's where we're burning most of the natural gas. It's where we're running out of natural gas. It's where we have the highest emissions. But when I look at the history, I think most of the innovation is coming from rural regions, right? It's coming from places like Igiage, because of ORPC. It's coming from, Western Alaska, where we first deploy wind. It's certainly at sizable, these larger turbines. And so I think rural Alaska has a tremendous amount to teach us about innovation in these moments.
Awesome thing. And when do you anticipate your book coming out?
Sure. So the book is slated to be published in 2027, hopefully in line for the 50th anniversary of TAPS.
Awesome. Dewey Bittler asks, is there any future or history to geothermal power around Cook Inlet?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating question. And there's other folks who can talk about this all day long, but I heard a fantastic presentation about, is it Mount Augustine or Mount Spur? I mean, if you look across Cook Inlet, extraordinary potential. And this kind of goes back to something that Doug was mentioning, and I talk to my students about this at the beginning of every semester. The problem is not lack of energy. There is energy all around us. The problem is, how do we sustainably harness it, right? And how do we economically deliver it to where it needs to go? So I am really excited about, future developments like geothermal and tidal and Cook Inlet. I mean, tremendous potential. And what I would say is we really need that electricity. And this is, again, kind of pushing back, I think, against a traditional environmentalist or conservationist view that really said we should use less electricity. And that was true at a time when we were really wasting electricity. Where we're at today, where we need to electrify the economy, what it means is we actually need to triple electricity production because we need to electrify heating and transportation. But through that, we will actually use less energy because electricity is so much more efficient than the combustion of fossil fuels. So really thinking about that distinction between energy and electricity is crucial for the present and our hopefully our clean energy future.
Oh, that's super interesting. I hadn't even considered that piece. And I know, so building transmission lines has tended to be a limiting factor in multiple projects. For example, Susitna Watana. And this is for Doug as well. How do you kind of see the past and the future of transmission lines in terms of, like, if that's a limiting factor, how does that work for a run-of-river turbine or for some of these other projects that are being proposed along the rail belt?
Well, I can speak to the run-of-river turbines. We want to be as close to the communities we're serving as we can be. Just a few hundred meters max is what we'd love to see, just like at Igiugig. Yeah, it's very expensive to build transmission, and it's small scales, it doesn't work. For kilowatt scale, it just anything more than a few hundred meters and you're in trouble. So I think that's the thing, is looking for new technology, ways to improve transmission would be great. But I think that for us it's the larger scale projects, the large wind, the potential with large geothermal, certainly potential for Cook Inlet tidal and other large tidal opportunities throughout Alaska. When you get to megawatt scale, all of a sudden, if we've got a load to serve, the economics start to really work.
Yeah, and maybe one thing I would just add in there is I think it is really hard to privately finance long distance transmission lines. And this is one reason why we must view the rail belt holistically. This is why we need an integrated resource plan, which we're doing for the first time in a public way right now. And it is why we need federal funding, right? The federal funding for what they're calling, I think it's the Cook Inlet Power Line Project, this high voltage DC line under Cook Inlet to bring Bradley Lake power more efficiently to the rail belt. It's going to make a big difference. It's a very expensive project. It relies on federal funding. But I think in making these economics work, we need to not just think about the projects that we're building today. We need to think about how these transmission lines create these electron superhighways that facilitate other renewable energy projects, right? You might have take the line to Beluga. It's a great example. So the Beluga line originally transferred natural gas power. Now it's going to transfer solar electrons from Chugach's new solar project out there. So once we build these infrastructures, they allow for the diversification of generation.
Great, thank you. So Chris Dunn, who is one of our past speakers, he did an amazing presentation on his trip down the Susitna from glacier to sea. But he's asking, Doug, these energy systems that you offer are the total energy of the system. Wait, these energy estimates you offer are the total energy of the system or realistically harnessable? I'm not quite. The energy estimates you offer are, I might need to ask him to rewrite that. I thought I understood it at first, but
Yeah, there's a real difference between what is sort of theoretically capturable and
okay.
what is realistically harvestable. in terms of what we can actually electrons that we can either move onto a grid or move into a community. There's really basic physics that limit what we can do. And we do a lot with hydrodynamics and modeling and trying to make our systems as efficient and effective as possible. And we've got a new generation of turbine we're working on right now that will be a game changer when it comes to Alaska. And it's so much more efficient and effective. It'll allow us to do what we're doing in Iyagig in many, many more places that actually have slower flows.
Awesome, thanks. And Chris also said that his great-grandfather was a civil engineer working on the Alcan during World War II. So that's
cool.
Yeah, all ties together. Mark Masteller raised his hand. Mark, if you want to put your question into the chat, that would be great. And then one question I have for you both is, what opportunities or what are you most excited about kind of as you're envisioning the next 10 to 20 years of Alaskan energy? Is there anything that kind of gets you fired up? Any projects you're particularly excited about, Doug, or opportunities that you see?
Yeah, I really was really taken by Phil's presentation, and I'm the fourth generation of my family to live here in Alaska. My great grandfather came in the gold rush at the turn of the century, and mined in Nome, and just seeing some of those old pictures, and we have a lot of those around our family. It's just remarkable how the change that we've seen, and the things that I'm excited about are really the sort of the change in the way that we perhaps do things and we power things. I mean, Phil talked about the transition around electric vehicles, which is really fantastic. And one of the things as a pilot I'm very interested in is low carbon flight. What can we do? And our airport at Ted Stevens, we use about 2.5 million gallons of jet fuel a day, and we have the resources in Alaska to make that fuel here in a much more lower carbon opportunity through what's called sustainable aviation fuel. And we literally have the opportunity to make that here. So those are the kind of projects that I would love to see us. I'd love to see us do, more. Instead of just burning hydrocarbons, what could we make with some of the hydrocarbons? What are some of the 21st century products that we could make with hydrocarbons instead of burning them that perhaps could even be recyclable in the future? So I just think there's a tremendous amount of creativity in Alaska. People have been very resourceful over time. And I look to our indigenous communities here because the first sunglasses were invented by the indigenous people of the Arctic. There's just some really fantastic, and they had to be really ingenious to live here in a very harsh environment. So I just think there's just a lot of opportunity. It is a challenging environment. And right now, when I say challenging environment, I don't mean the physical environment, I mean the political environment. Right now, the current administration is not very friendly to renewables, particularly, unfortunately, with wind and solar. They've just got their legs cut out from underneath them around the tax credits. Fortunately, we survived that because we're considered hydro. So. It's going to allow us to continue in many ways. Unfortunately, for wind and solar, that's a bit abated here for a time, but hopefully we'll get smart and we'll wake that back up again. So anyway, that's my take on it.
Yeah, no, Doug, I would echo so much what you just said there. And if Margaret, if you asked me that question about a year and a half ago, I would have talked about this golden opportunity that we had because Alaska got so much funding from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, from the Inflation Reduction Act, and where we're sitting today, we've lost probably $1.5 billion in federal funding that could have absolutely transformed the Railbelt at this crucial moment when we were running out of our biggest energy source. And so, I mean, I don't think most Alaskans have woken up to the scale of the energy crisis that is potentially coming. And it doesn't mean that people's lights are going to get turned out overnight, but it means that the prices are going to go way up. And we're going to be having to burn things like diesel, right? And so, I think we are entering this period where we really need to see megawatt scale renewable development throughout the Railbelt. I'm so excited by the work that Doug is doing. But I also think this is a moment because of the political headwinds where we need to think about what can we do when it comes to individual residences, individual homes. And part of this, you look back over the past decade, individual Alaskan homeowners have installed more solar than our utilities have. Right? That will change hopefully with Chugach and Beluga. But if you give individual Alaskans the tools, they will invest their personal money and they will bring about the energy sources that make their lives better. So how can we do that when it comes to a variety of different technologies, when it comes to plug-in solar, when it comes to EVs, when it comes to heat pumps? I mean, this is a moment where, because of the federal government, I think we need to be often hyper focused locally.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I also kind of that ingenuity piece that you're talking about, it brings back that slide where the water line is being repurposed for hydropower and how energy across the rail belt can't be one big thing. It's going to be lots of not small necessarily, but smaller kind of local projects. And yeah, it's all very,
Absolutely right
yeah.
sized.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good term. Well, we're kind of coming up on the hour, and I just want to make sure if anybody has any more questions or if you have any questions for each other, two experts in the room, wanted to make sure that folks had a chance to ask them.
Maybe Doug, I'll pick your brain here for a moment and just ask you a question. If you think about the best possible world with the deployment of ORPC's technology, is there a goal that you think about or that you and your colleagues think about? Um, you know, 10 years from now, could we be talking about 30 megawatts of hydroconnect or tidal energy? What are some of the goals and numbers that you dream about?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, Phil. And we do dream a lot, but we're very realistic in terms of trying to be conservative in our estimates. But we're conservatively, we think we can get 400 megawatts on the grid by 2050. That's very conservative. Once we show that we can cohabitate in the environment with the natural environment that's there, and the marine mammals particularly, as well as all the species that live in the inlet. Once we show that we can cohabitate, and we deal with all the environmental issues associated with ice. And we've already retired the risk about the sediment, suspended sediment silts. We actually designed our bearings with using Cook Inlet water in the flume. So we really worked with the mechanical engineering department at the university to do that. So yeah, I think that once we retire that, I think that 400 megawatts is very real, and that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what the resource is. But the other thing that I've got to say is that we've got to continue to improve our grid infrastructure, and we've got to attract more load to Alaska before you're going to see that kind of power developed, because we have to have a load to serve to develop that resource. And the thing that excites me, somebody said, what excites you? I think you asked the question, Margaret. One thing that excites me is, what's the future for my grandchildren? I have three of them now, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old grandchildren. And I just look to say, what are we going to do to make sure that they have all the opportunity and the amazement of what it is like to live in Alaska, 50 years from now. So that excites me.
I love that answer. I've got nothing better that I could add to that.
I think that's a great statement to wrap up on: excitement for the future and excitement for future generations. Um, and with that, I'm going to bring on Ali Sargent, SRC's energy coordinator, who connected me with these great speakers today to talk a little bit about some of the events that she has coming up. I invited her on because I don't think I'm the right person to talk about them. She's spearheading a couple things here. So, um, Ali, I think I'm moving you to panelist. Oh, here we go. So she has, oh, there we go. Go ahead, Ali.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Phil and Doug. I learn something new every time I listen to you both talk. I could listen to it for hours. Yeah, so we have a couple of exciting events coming up surrounding energy. February 16th, Monday at the Palmer Train Depot, we're hosting our night called Stories of Free Rivers and Wild Salmon. We're going to be showing two short films about hydropower, the Super Salmon and Undammed. Then have a panel discussion with some local, state, and national level voices on well-sited hydropower and the consequences of hydropower that is not well-sited and damages habitat. So that'll be February 16th. We'll send out more info of that on our newsletter and our social media if you're following there. And then speaking of electric cooperatives, the Matanuska Electric Association elections are coming up. They will start around April 3rd and will continue through the entire month of April and end at the annual meeting, April 28th. So if you're looking to get involved with the election at all or want more info on voting, make sure to reach out. They will be moving to entirely online voting system this year unless you request a mail-in ballot. So if you're used to receiving one in the mail, you need to now request that this year, and you can do that till March 16th. So we'll be sending out more information, but it's a great time to get involved in energy, and we hope to see you at some events soon.
Thanks, Allie, and thanks for letting me put you somewhat on the spot here tonight. Well, thank you so much, Doug and Phil, for being here this evening. I will make sure to send out their contact information and any resources that they think would be interesting and exciting to folks that were on this call. And just so you know, all of our winter speaker events that are recorded are on our YouTube channel, so you can always rewatch. And I will let you guys have the screen for a second if there's anything else you would like to add to close out.
I'd just like to say thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. And I've learned a ton. I love this kind of thing. I love the questions. I love when it's more dialogue than presentation. So well done. Thank you so much. And I'll say adios for now.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you all so much, and look forward to hearing from you again. Well, good night, everyone.